We'll start in 1 minute. Today we'll solve quadratic equations using the quadratic formula and completing the square. We'll pick up from where we left off yesterday. But what we're going to do on the left part of the page, we'll solve the equation using the quadratic formula. And we'll solve 6 equations using the quadratic formula. Then we'll come back, and on the right side of the page, we'll solve by completing the square. So knowing both of those methods is valuable. So first we'll start with the quadratic formula. For 4x squared plus 6x plus 1 equals 0, a is 4, b is 6, and c is 1. And you should memorize the quadratic formula, or at least be able to derive it like we did. So x equals negative b, so negative 6 plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. So 6 squared minus 4 times 4 times 1. All divided by 2 times 4. And then do the arithmetic. X equals negative 6 plus and minus the square root of some number in the denominator. 2 times 4 is 8. So inside the square root, 6 to the second is 36, and we're subtracting 16. 36 minus 16 is 20. And then we can simplify the square root of 20. 4 times 5 is 20, and the square root of 4 is 2. So we can write this as x equals negative 6 plus and minus 2 times the square root of 5, all divided by 8. And here's where you have to be careful when you write it in lower terms. 2 is a common factor of both terms in the numerator, the negative 6, as well as the positive and negative 2 times the square root of 5. And 2 is a factor of 8. So when you cancel the common factor of 2, you're going to get negative 3 plus and minus the square root of 5, all divided by 4. Okay, let's solve the next equation using the quadratic formula. 9x squared plus 12x plus 4 equals 0. Okay, on this one, a is equal to 9, b equals 12, c equals 4. So we write x equals negative 12, that's the negative b part, plus and minus the square root of 12 to the second minus 4 times 9 times 4, all divided by 2 times 9. And then we do the arithmetic. X equals negative 12 plus and minus the square root of some number. 12 squared is 144. And 4 times 9 is 36, and 36 times 4 is 144. And then we're dividing by 2 times 9, or 18. Okay, so here we get negative 12 plus and minus the square root of 0, which is 0. So there's just one repeated solution. Negative 12 over 18 simplifies to negative 2/3. So there's one repeated solution. So what does that mean again, if there's one repeated solution? Or equivalently, when the discriminant is 0, the b to the second minus 4ac is 0. Well, that means that the trinomial is either a perfect square trinomial or a constant multiple of a perfect square trinomial. In this case, 9x squared plus 12x plus 4 is a perfect square trinomial. So we could have solved by factoring. Okay, the next problem, let's use the quadratic formula to solve this equation. 2x squared plus 8x plus 9 equals 0. For this one, a equals 2, b equals 8, c equals 9. So x equals negative b. b is 8, so negative 8 plus and minus the square root of b to the second minus 4ac. So in this case, it's the square root of 8 to the second minus 4 times 2 times 9, all divided by 2 times a, or 2 times 2. Okay, then arithmetic, x equals negative 8 plus and minus the square root of a number divided by 4, 2 times 4. 2 times 2 is 4 in the denominator. So inside the square root, 8 to the second is 64. And we're subtracting 4 times 2 times 8. 4 times 2 is, 4 times 2 times 9. 4 times 2 is 8. 8 times 9 is 72. So this time we have a negative discriminant. X equals negative 8 plus and minus the square root of negative 8, all divided by 4. So we need to simplify a little further. The square root of negative 8 is the square root of 8 times the square root of negative 1. And then we're going to simplify the square root of 8. And then I have a question, why is 8 negative? Well, 64 minus 72 is negative 8. Or do you mean the other 8? Since b is 8, then remember what the quadratic formula says. X equals negative b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. So maybe you could clarify, which 8 are you referring to? The negative 8 that comes to the left of plus and minus, or the negative 8 inside the square root? Anyway, let's proceed. When we simplify the square root of negative 8, that's going to be 2 times I times the square root of 2. So we'll write x equals negative 8 plus and minus 2 times I times the square root of 2 divided by 4. And every term in the numerator has a common factor of 2, and the 2 is a factor of the denominator. So when we cancel a common factor of 2, we're going to get -4 plus and minus I times the square root of 2 divided by 2. You have to make sure you cancel the factor 2 from every term in the numerator as well as the denominator. Okay, let's move on to the next page. So make sure that you know the quadratic formula. So at the very top, I'll just remind you, if you practice writing it down from memory a lot of times, then when it comes time to be tested over it, you won't have to panic. You'll know it by heart. So the solutions to ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, or x equals -b plus and minus the square root of b to the second minus 4ac, all divided by 2 times a. So memorize that perfectly. All it takes is one mistake in your memory to foul everything up. Okay, we'll use the quadratic formula to solve this equation. So on this one, a is 4, b is -20, c is 25. So x equals the negative of -20, that's the negative b part, plus and minus the square root of the number -20 squared minus 4 times 4 times 25, all divided by 2 times 4. Okay, then we do the arithmetic. The negative of -20 is +20, plus and minus the square root of a number, all divided by 8. So inside the square root, the number -20 squared, -20 times -20 is 400. And we're subtracting 4 times 4 times 25. One technique for multiplying these is to first multiply 4 times 25, which is 100, and then 4 times 100 is 400. That might be easier than multiplying 4 times 4, which is 16, and then 16 times 25, which is also 400. But anyway, we have another 0 for a discriminant. So we get x equals 20 plus and minus the square root of 0 divided by 8. Square root of 0 is 0, so we have a repeated solution, 20 divided by 8. And then we want to write it in lower terms. So this reduces to 5/2. So if we have a repeated solution, then the trinomial that we started with in the quadratic equation is either a perfect square trinomial or a constant multiple of a perfect square trinomial. Since the greatest common factor of all 3 terms is 1, that must mean 4x squared minus 20x plus 25 is a perfect square trinomial. And you can verify it if you factor this. You'll discover that the two factors are 2x minus 5 times 2x minus 5, or 2x minus 5 squared. Okay, the next one, 3x squared minus 6x plus 4 equals 0. So solve this by using the quadratic formula. So A is 3, B is negative 6, C is positive 4. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to work this one out using the quadratic formula. We'll compare answers in a couple of minutes. Well, raise your hand when you get finished. Is anybody watching on YouTube finished with that one? Okay, I got one message. One person is finished. You guys done? Okay, let's go through this one. A is 3, B is negative 6, and C is positive 4. So x equals the negative of negative 6 plus and minus the square root of the number negative 6 squared minus 4 times 3 times 4, all divided by 2 times 3. Then the arithmetic, the negative of negative 6 is 6, plus and minus the square root of a number, all divided by 6. Inside the square root, the number negative 6 squared is 36. And we're subtracting 4 times 3 times 4, which is 12 times 4, or minus 48. So we have another negative discriminant. So that means the solutions are non-real numbers, non-real complex numbers. 6 plus and minus the square root of negative 12, all divided by 6. To simplify the square root of negative 12, think of that as the square root of 12 times the square root of negative 1. The square root of 12 is 2 times the square root of 3, and then we multiply by I. So this is 6 plus and minus 2 times I times the square root of 3 divided by 6. And we can reduce this further. Every term in the numerator has a common factor of 2. So when we cancel the common factor of 2, we get 3 plus and minus I times the square root of 3 divided by 3. Okay, work on the next one for a couple of minutes. For this quadratic equation, A is 5, B is negative 5, C is negative 4. So x equals the negative of negative 5 plus and minus the square root of negative 5, the number negative 5 squared minus 4 times 5 times negative 4. All of that inside the square root. Divide everything by 2 times 5. The negative of negative 5 is 5, plus and minus the square root of a number. The number negative 5 squared is positive 25. And we're subtracting 4 times 5 times negative 4. So we're subtracting negative 80 and dividing it all by 10. 2 times 5 is 10. So inside the square root, 25 minus negative 80 is 25 plus 80. And then the final step, x equals 5 plus and minus the square root of 105, all divided by 10. So can we simplify this answer further? The square root of 105 cannot be simplified further. The largest factor of 105 that is a perfect square is 1. And so we can't write this in lower terms. A common error, so I hesitate to mention the common error because sometimes students remember it and think that's what they're supposed to do instead of what they're not supposed to do. You will notice that 5 and 10 have a common factor of 5, but the square root of 105 does not have a factor of 5. So when it's written in this form, it cannot be written in lower terms. Okay, let's go back to the original page for today. Ignore what we did when we solved by using the quadratic formula. Let's practice solving by completing the square, because every quadratic equation can be solved by completing the square. Okay, so I'll move this sheet over a little bit so that we can't see what we've already done, but I'll rewrite the quadratic equation, 4x squared plus 6x plus 1 equals 0. Okay, solve by completing the square. The first thing to do is subtract 1 from both sides. So we get 4x squared plus 6x equals negative 1. Then we're going to divide every term on both sides of the equation by 4. So 4x squared divided by 4 is x squared. 6x divided by 4 is 6 over 4 times x, or when you write it in lowest terms, it's 3/2 times x. And then divide negative 1 by 4, so we get negative 1/4. The next step, we're going to create a perfect square trinomial by adding a number to both sides of the equation. So on this one, the number that we're going to add, first we take 1/2 of the coefficient of x, 1/2 of 3/2, which is 3/4. And then we're going to square 3/4 to get 9/16. So that is the number that we're going to add to both sides. So we'll have x to the second plus 3/2 x plus 9/16 equals negative 1/4 plus 9/16. The left-hand side is now a perfect square trinomial. So that means we can write it as a binomial squared. So the binomial has to have x because the perfect square trinomial has x squared. And then the number that follows is the same number we got when we took 1/2 of 3/2, which is 3/4. So that means we have x plus 3/4 quantity squared. And then on the right-hand side, we want to simplify negative 1/4 plus 9/16. So you can think of negative 1/4 as negative 4/16, which we add to 9/16, and we get positive 5/16. So we have x plus 3/4 quantity squared equals 5/16. Now we apply the square root property. And when we apply the square root property, we get x plus 3/4 equals positive and negative square root of 5/16. The square root of 5/16 can be simplified because the denominator 16 is a perfect square. So in the next step, we'll do a couple of things. We'll subtract 3/4, so we get x equals negative 3/4, plus and minus the square root of 5, divided by the square root of 16, which is 4. Okay, so you can write the solutions or the fractions or where those two numbers are separated with the plus and minus. Or if you prefer, you can write it, that entire numerator, all over the denominator 4. So what do you think is easier, using the quadratic formula or just solving the equation by completing the square?
Quadratic formula.
Yeah, I got one vote for a quadratic formula. And I'll agree that in some cases, especially when fractions are involved, it is easier in those cases to use the quadratic formula. Maybe some of our examples, you'll have a different opinion for certain quadratic equations. It's sort of a case-by-case thing. Okay, but let's still practice it. If for some reason you forget something about the quadratic formula, if you at least know the process for completing the square method, then you'll still be able to solve the equation. Okay, so this next one, the equation 9x squared plus 12x plus 4 equals 0. We begin by subtracting 4. So 9x squared plus 12x equals negative 4. Then we divide every term on both sides by 9. 9x squared divided by 9 is x squared. 12x divided by 9 simplifies to 4/3 times x. And then on the right-hand side, negative 4/9. Okay, the next step is completing the square step, or the creating a perfect square trinomial on the left-hand side of the equation step. So we want to add a number to both sides so that the left-hand side is a perfect square trinomial. So what we do is we take 1/2 of 4/3. So 1/2 times 4/3 is 2/3. And then we square that number. 2/3 squared is 4/9. So we add 4/9 to both sides. We get x squared plus 4/3 x plus 4/9 equals negative 4/9 plus 4/9. But negative 4/9 plus 4/9 is 0. Okay, but we proceed. X squared plus 4/3 x plus 4/9 is a perfect square trinomial. So that means it's equal to some binomial squared. The binomial has to have x because the trinomial has x squared. And the number that follows x is the same number that we got when we took 1/2 of 4/3. So that number is 2/3. We have x plus 2/3. Quantity squared equals 0. Then we apply the square root property. So x plus 2/3 equals positive and negative square root of 0. The square root of 0 is 0, and positive 0 is just 0, and negative 0 is just 0. So this isn't really necessary, but I'll write x plus 2/3 equals 0. And then when we solve for x, we get x equals negative 2/3. So there's just one solution. Same as when we use the quadratic formula. Okay, let's do the next one solve it by completing the square. So the better you can get at arithmetic, the better off you'll be in all of your math classes from now on, because all of your math classes requires arithmetic in some way. Okay, so 2x squared plus 8x plus 9 equals 0. We're solving this by completing the square. So first, subtract 9 from both sides. We get 2x squared plus 8x equals negative 9. Then divide every term on both sides by 2. 2x squared divided by 2 is x squared. 8x divided by 2 is 4x. Negative 9 divided by 2 is negative 9/2. And now we complete the square. So we're going to add a number to both sides. So the number we add, first we take 1/2 of the coefficient of x. So 1/2 of 4 is 2. Then we square that number. 2 to the second is 4. So we're going to add 4 to both sides. X squared plus 4x plus 4 equals negative 9/2 plus 4. Negative 9/2 plus 4 is negative 9/2 plus 8/2, which is negative 1/2. Okay, so this is now a perfect square trinomial, x squared plus 4x plus 4. So that means it's equal to some binomial squared. Okay, so what binomial is it? the binomial has to have x because the trinomial has x squared. The number follows is the same number that we got when we took 1/2 of 4, which is positive 2. So we have x plus 2 squared equals negative 1/2. Then we apply the square root property, and we get x plus 2 equals positive and negative square root of negative 1/2. So on this one, we have a couple of things to do. Let's go ahead and subtract 2 from both sides. So we have x equals negative 2 plus and minus. And I'll rewrite the square root of negative 1/2 as the square root of 1 over the square root of 2 times I, because the square root of negative 1. And then we're going to have to rationalize the denominator. So x equals negative 2 plus and minus, the square root of 1 is 1, so we have 1 divided by the square root of 2. To rationalize the denominator, we multiply by 1 in the form square root of 2 over the square root of 2, and then times I. And this part simplifies to negative 2 plus and minus the square root of 2 over 2 times I. This is equivalent to the answer we got using the quadratic formula. It's just that the negative 2 is equivalent to negative 4 over 2. But the square root of 2 times I still has a denominator of 2. So this is an okay answer, but if you want everything to be over 2, then you have to multiply negative 2 by 2 over 2. So if you do that, you'll get x equals negative 4 plus and minus the square root of 2 times I all over 2. Okay, let's start working on the next page. Solve by completing the square. So here we have 4x squared minus 20x plus 25 equals 0. So first subtract 25 from both sides. We get 4x squared minus 20x equals negative 25. Then divide every term on both sides by 4. 4x squared divided by 4 is x squared. 20x, negative 20x divided by 4 is negative 5x. We have minus 5x. And negative 25 divided by 4 is negative 25 fourths. Now we're ready to add a number to both sides so that we have a perfect square trinomial on the left-hand side. The coefficient of x is negative 5, so we take 1/2 of negative 5, which is negative 5 halves. And then we square negative 5 halves. Negative 5 halves squared is 25 fourths. So we're going to add 25 fourths to both sides. And we get x squared minus 5x plus 25 fourths. On the right-hand side, negative 25 fourths plus 25 fourths. We get 0. And then x squared minus 5x plus 25 fourths is a perfect square trinomial. So it's equal to some binomial squared, and the right-hand side is 0. So what's the binomial that we have to square that when squared equals x squared minus 5x plus 25/4?
X minus 5x.
Yeah, we know that the binomial has to have x because the perfect square trinomial has x squared. The number that follows is the same one that we get when we took 1/2 of -5. So that number is -5/2, so inside the parentheses we write x minus 5/2. Hey, then when we apply the square root property, x minus 5/2 is 0 because positive and negative square root of 0 is just 0. And then add 5/2, we get 5/2 for the solution. Okay, all of these examples so far involve fractions, so I'm not surprised that you would prefer to use the quadratic formula in those cases. Okay, let's start the next one. 3x squared minus 6x plus 4. Solved by completing the square. 3x squared minus 6x plus 4 equals 0. So step 1, subtract 4 from both sides. We get 3x squared minus 6x equals -4. Then divide every term on both sides by 3. And we get x squared minus 2x equals -4/3. And then we complete the square. We have to add a number to both sides of the equation so that the left-hand side is a perfect square trinomial. So the coefficient of x is -2. So the procedure is take 1/2 of that number -2, which is -1. And then we square that number. The number -1 squared is +1. So we're going to add 1 to both sides. And -4/3 plus 1 is -1/3. Okay, the left-hand side is a perfect square trinomial. X squared minus 2x plus 1 is equal to the binomial x minus 1 squared. So x minus 1 squared equals -1/3. Then we apply the square root property, and we get x minus 1 equals positive and negative square root of -1/3. So in the next step, I'll add 1 to both sides. So we get x equals 1 plus and minus. And then the square root of -1/3, well, the square root of 1 is 1, so I'll write it as 1 over the square root of 3 times I, because we're taking the square root of -1. And then to rationalize the denominator, we have to multiply 1 over the square root of 3 by 1 in the form square root of 3 over the square root of 3. So 1 over the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 over the square root of 3 times I. And then finally we get x equals 1 plus and minus the square root of 3 over 3 times I. So this is an okay answer, or the first time we did it, we had the entire expression in the numerator all over 3, but those are equivalent. Okay, we're down to less than a minute. So we can at least start the last one. 5x squared minus 5x minus 4 equals 0. Begin by adding 4 to both sides. We get 5x squared minus 5x equals 4. Then divide every term on both sides by 5. We get x squared minus x equals 4/5. So what do we add to both sides so that the left-hand side is a perfect square trinomial? The coefficient of x is -1. So we take 1/2 of -1, which is -1/2. And then we square that number. -1/2 squared is +1/4. So I'll just write down this next step, and then we'll be done. We have x squared minus x plus 1/4 equals 4/5 plus 1/4. That's all we have time for today. So tomorrow we'll be in the next section, section 9.4.